Hey, everybody, welcome back to episode 8 of the Dog Trainers Podcast. We are going to be discussing a podcast done by Stuff You Should Know. It's by Chuck Bryant, Josh Clark, and they talk about dog training. So let's dive in.
Welcome to the Dog Trainers Podcast, a podcast created by dog trainers, for dog trainers, or anyone who's ever fallen in love with man's best friend. Episode 8, our commentary on iHeartRadio's podcast, Stuff You Should Know. Their episode is entitled How Dog Training Works. What's up, everybody? My name is Brent, and that guy is Mariano, and welcome back to the Dog Trainers Podcast. This is episode 8, and we have a special treat for you guys. We are actually commenting for the very first time on another person's podcast that we listen to. Now, the podcast in question is called Stuff You Should Know. The episode is called How Dog Training Works. One of my clients actually sent this over to me and said, Brent, what are your thoughts on this? And I actually love the podcast so much. I actually just wanted to give my 2 cents in, and I sent it over to Mariano to see what he thought about it. So Mariano, did you get a chance to listen to the podcast yet?
Yeah, I checked it out. I listened to it a couple times. It was definitely, it's enjoyable. I can see why these guys are big. Because I know that they do the Stuff You Should Know isn't like a dog training podcast. They do all kinds of different topics. And this episode just happened to be on dog training and their thoughts on it, the way that they framed the different methodologies. And there's definitely some stuff that I liked a lot. There's a few things that I kind of took issue with and I wanted to dive into them. So I figured I'd let you start with that.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I would agree. I think, these guys are not professional dog trainers. However, they love their dogs, and it's super obvious when you hear them talk and you hear the little anecdotes. They have great personalities, but at the same time, they don't know what professional dog trainers know, right? So pretty much what the point of what we got from the whole podcast is that the podcast was comparing a very commonly polarized view of dog training, right? So people, they're talking about what they call the dominant movement in dog training, and then the positive reinforcement. Right now, as dog trainers, we deal with this dichotomy all the time. We deal with, are you dominant or are you positive reinforcement, right? The funny thing, and this is the biggest thing we're trying to teach as many people as possible, is it's not black and white in dog training. Right. There is so many different, I wouldn't say it's gray. I would say there's so many different colors in between black and white that exist within the dog training world. But unfortunately, the way the media, marketing, all that stuff kind of frames it, it constantly puts what they call dominant dog training up against what they would consider the positive reinforcement movement. And can't blame them. This is pop culture. This is the media. Unfortunately, what I realize is we know as much about dog training as we know about health, right? So what I mean by that is everything we know about health is something that was taught to us by marketing. So if I were to ask someone super simply, like, what's the key to fitness? They would say, like, eat right and
Exercise.
Eat right and exercise, and you'll be fit. Right. But then why are we so worried about the vitamins? Why are we so worried about the supplements? Why are we so worried about the meal preps? Why are we so worried about the right workout equipment? Why are we so worried about all this? So what happens is marketing, when people want to sell something, they tend to overcomplicate it to make you feel that you need this. And the sad part about dog training is that that's all we know about dog training, right? So we know what we're told. And unfortunately, we only know the population knows what's ever been on TV, right? That's what we know of dog training. So if there was a show on it, we know about it. If there was a show that showed the opposite side of it, right? Then we know about that method and those ideologies, right? So unfortunately, we only know what we see on TV. And this is the downside to dog training as it is to health.
Can I just say really quick, because it was on like the tip of my tongue and I'm sure it was to everybody listening. It felt when you were talking about dog training, like black and white, it almost felt like you were specifically avoiding using the term 50 Shades of Grey because I was thinking about it. And it almost felt passive aggressive because I wanted you to say it. I'm kidding. Oh, also, one more thing. Sorry.
Well, you just like 50 Shades of Grey. I get it.
One more thing. Sorry.
The reason I didn't want to say gray is because gray does not provoke the right idea, right? There's different colors, right? Different ideas, different places we start, different personalities of dogs. The same way I to say that a dog is light gray in their training needs light gray training method is not what I was going for. So anyway, go ahead.
Got it. Oh, no, sorry. Just last thing. It's dumb, but again, it was on the tip of my tongue and it'll haunt me if I don't. So this is our first time talking about, another podcast as a response. So other people's podcast, OPP, boom, suck it. Please continue.
Got it. OPP. Yeah, you know me. All right. So here we go. We kind of broke this up into 3 sections. The first section, they really break down what they would consider to be the 2 opposing forces, right? So they brought up what dominant dog training is and what positive reinforcement dog training is. And in this first section, yes, they try their best to stay neutral, but very quickly into the podcast, we start seeing that they obviously choose sides, right? And here's the funny thing: there are no sides to be chosen right now. So to put it simply, if you guys get a chance to listen, it is a very good podcast. I listened to some of the other episodes also. Very well put together. I love these personalities. However, when it comes to dog training, what our specialty is, we're gonna talk about a couple buzzwords. We're gonna break down a little bit more of an in-depth understanding of these things. And if you guys want to hear what they say, listen to the podcast. And then go ahead and listen to our podcast right after, and then you'll be able to kind of have a broader understanding and education of what's going on. Okay.
Right.
So let's see. Positive reinforcement. Dominant. So they talk about dominance dog training a lot. So dominance dog training, it's been around for a while. What would you say your definition of dominance? Like, let's talk about the cultural definition of dominant dog training, and then we'll get into some explanations.
Okay. So I'll give you my definition. We'll get into some explanations. And then I want to make a quick point right now in the beginning before we proceed. Mm-hmm. So dominance in the cultural kind of pop culture, like normally understood sense, is someone or something who is kind of above you for whatever reason. They're either smarter than you, stronger than you, faster than you. Right. And so to be dominant over your dog, people assume a sort of like forcefulness to the way that you go about like forcing your dog to submit to certain things.
It's kind of a bit of a tyrannical stance.
Right.
Got it. Sorry, continue. Go ahead.
That's okay. So if we talk about an example, are we talking about an example of here, I'll do it like this. An example.
Some of the examples that they talked about.
Okay, perfect. So an example that they talked about things like hitting your dog, kicking your dog, the alpha roll, like when you flop your dog over to the side and kind of hold them down to the ground. And they were framing these all in what was the other one? The muzzle grab that we grab the dog's like jowls and
the scruff shake or the
scruff shake. Yeah. And there was one with the mouth. Either way, so these were certain examples that they were giving, and they were using verbiage like you suppress the dog and it could be effective.
You break their spirit.
Right. You break their spirit. So essentially it was kind of like, it'll get you results, but at what cost is how they made it sound. So the point that I wanted to make really quick, and then I'll let you continue, is when we talk about it sounded like they did try to be neutral to an extent, but even if they have, a stance that they align with more, that's fine. The problem is they presented a very realistic idea of positive reinforcement with a very cartoonish / outdated, if it ever was dated, idea of dominance. And the problem with this is that means the entire premise of this 45-minute podcast is like askew. So they're putting up a false flag there of like, oh, don't do this horrible thing, do this clearly better thing. But in the more balanced training category, there is a better thing too. So you have to compare apples to apples. So go ahead.
Right. And I wouldn't say necessarily, I don't think necessarily they were educating people on things that they didn't already think. I think they were just kind of reiterating what pop culture already is on dog training. So let us go ahead and fill in those gaps. One big thing that they talked about is they talked about how the dominance training methods, ideas all came from a really early observation of wolf behavior in captivity, which is totally true. The number one thing that we do, I mean, this has been debunked now for like 15, 20 years. We know scientifically this is the case. However, again, we only know what we've seen on TV. So Cesar Millan brought back this idea of leadership and dominance and, asserting yourself and all these things. So now it culturally, it seems like a new idea, but this has been debunked for 20, 30 years now. Right. So what they were trying to say is that wolves lived in this militant hierarchy, alpha, beta, omega, all this stuff. And that's how our families and everything should be structured. And that's how that's how dog families are structured. And that's how we should, in essence, belittle our dogs and make them feel less than. And these types of theories and ideas, they don't really exist in the context that they were explaining. They do for people who don't spend a lot of time with dogs or only know dogs on the surface level. But in the dog training culture right now, it does exist out there still. There are some people who solely believe in that because it's the simple way of looking at things. But when you're more balanced dog trainers like me and Mariano, we really have to look at things in a broader spectrum. So, however, I just want to be clear, dominance dog training has been debunked. However, the need for leadership, for structure, for routines, and giving your dog both desirable and undesirable feedback for their behavior while they're learning and you're raising them, that is never argued in dog training.
Right. And I just wanted to be clear with, I'm not denying the existence of dominant dog training. What I'm getting at is to suggest that it's a mainstream ideology today is just not true. It's fringe at best. So positive, like pure positive, is huge, super mainstream. A lot of the biggest dog trainers I can name off the top of my head right now are like pure positive people. But balanced, kind of more nuanced, more modern dog training that is positive, but also does use corrections and other forms of aversives. That's really the other side of the coin right now. Not like full on dominance from however many years ago where you like roll the dog over and kick it.
Right. Exactly. So now over the years, right, the word dominance has had a really bad connotation with society. But in dog training, it comes up all the time, right? So as teachers, what we have to do is we have to actually really define to what we mean if the word dominance ever comes up, what we actually mean as balanced dog trainers. And so definitely no slamming, no pinning, no yelling, no aggression, no pain should be involved in the raising of your dog, right? However, that doesn't mean that sometimes we may not have to physically control our dogs, mentally control our dogs, or emotionally control our dogs, right? So what this means is dominance, simply put, is our physical, mental, and emotional influence over another creature. Right. So, for example, if we look at physical dominance, let's look at child raising. Let's say you have a 3 or 4-year-old kid who sees a bunny on the other side of the street, and all of a sudden your 3 or 4-year-old kid decides to go, "Ooh, bunny," and runs across. I'm not necessarily going to call my kid back, with a treat or a candy bar. I'm not necessarily going to click my kid to get him to come over here. What we have to do in that moment is we have to physically take action to stop my kid from running into the middle of the street, right? Especially if my kid is fixated on the bunny rabbit, right? Because they think it's so cute because they watched Bugs Bunny when they were a kid, when they at home, right? So the idea of physical influence, of being able to physically stop your dog from doing something, physically grab your dog, sometimes have to restrain our dogs if they're being aggressive. That is always going to be a part of dominance, influence, whatever it is, right? We're going to refer to dominance as influence. So we need to be able to physically control our dogs, number one. Okay. Number two, when we're talking about mental influence, what we're talking about determination. We're talking about willfulness. We're talking about persistence. We're talking about all these great qualities that we love in human nature, and in sports and in all the competitive things, but we, for some reason, hate it when we're talking about our four-legged friends, right? So mental dominance is about determination, right? So many times what we see in the animal world, especially with domesticated dogs, how is it that my little cat can control my giant Rottweiler? Or how is it that the smallest Chihuahua is in control of 3 pit bulls? right? It's because it has nothing to do necessarily with physical dominance, right? And we see this amongst domesticated animals. What it has to do, with how that animal thinks. So mental influence, mental dominance, whatever you want to refer to it, is also part of it, right? If you think of our parents, my mother's 4'11", and she can look at me and my two brothers, and she can strike fear in our hearts. And did our mom beat us and kick us and do all those things? No. No, she didn't, but she can definitely get inside of our heads. Okay. And then the third part is going to be emotional influence. So giving emotional context to things, how a dog should feel, or how letting a dog know how we feel about a situation so that they can react to it. So all these three influences, physical, mental, and emotional, these are all part of this general idea of dominance, but it's never going to be taught to people like that, because it just took me about 10 minutes or 5 minutes to explain to you guys dominance. This is the modern interpretation of what it is, right? Dominance exists between a relationship, but dominance doesn't mean be mean, tough, aggressive, any of those things. It just means influence over something else. And so our job is definitely to have influence over our dogs.
Right. Yeah, and I think context was another point that we kept bringing up with that podcast, because
Mm-hmm.
when we
Mm-hmm.
talk about dominance and a dog's motivation or their insistence or their, it all depends, because a lot of it was framed as like you're crushing your dog's spirit.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
if a dog's insistent or motivated, or all these things sound great until you add a little context. So, well, motivated to do what?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's good, great, okay. Sometimes it's not. I mean, I don't want my dog motivated to bolt out of my door and run down the street. I don't want
Right.
my dog motivated to like bite the mailman the day for some reason he can get to him. So there are certain things that just because the dog wants it, because dogs don't, they do what makes sense to them, which without training isn't always the same thing that makes sense to us, and it's not
Mm-hmm.
always acceptable. you know
Right.
there's definitely lots of pitfalls that come with allowing dogs to be dogs. I've heard that one before, and to a minor extent I kind of agree. Like, yeah, if dogs want to play around, and my dumb
Yeah.
dog for whatever reason doesn't lay in the bed I bought him outside, he lays on the floor, like right next to the bed, and I'm like, all right, whatever, dogs are going to be dogs. He doesn't like it for whatever reason,
Right.
that's fine, but it is my job to keep him safe even from himself.
Right. And I think again, it's understood by people who use the terminology. And don't get me wrong, there are people who skew it because they're insecure or have aggressive tendencies themselves. I totally get that. But what we're trying to say when the word dominance is used, or we redefine it, we have to make sure that we understand as dog owners that we take the role, the responsibility as the influential force in the relationship with our dog.
Mhm.
Right? We're the ones guiding them through what needs to happen. We're the ones that are telling them what we like, what we don't like, because ultimately the dog has to understand how to live within our lifestyle. And a lot of times I see people with their dogs who they want to be equals to the dog, or they put the dog above themselves, right? The dog's needs are the most important. My needs mean nothing, right? So I know people who haven't taken vacations because their dog has separation anxiety and they can't leave the house because they feel that badly about it, right? So really when a dog trainer refers to dominance, they're trying to say kind of take that influential role as for the dog, right? In essence, be the parent. And they refer to this as well. Alpha male, alpha female is just mom and dad, right? And a lot of times what happens is we see in relationships, people are taking the role of the buddy, the roommate, the best friend, in some situations, the girlfriend or the boyfriend of the dog, right? And we just want to just reiterate, uh, we want to make sure that our audience knows you have to make sure that you take the responsibility of being the influencer in the relationship.
Right.
That's that. Okay. So that's section one. So that was kind of our notes on section one of what we wanted to talk about. I hope that gave you guys a more of a broad, um, I just wanted to give you guys more of a broad understanding of that. All right. So now, second thing, go ahead and talk about part two. What did they talk about, Mariano?
Techniques for dominance theory. So that's when we get into a little more of the practical kind of how to. So they were talking about things like the alpha roll, dominance downs, like pinning the dog to the ground or pinning the dog to a side, or showing the dog that you're in charge, and a lot of it I think had connotation that went backwards, and and really focused on the owner or the trainer. That was like, if your dog goes outside to go for a walk, it's possible they just want to go for a walk. Or don't automatically assume that the dog is like walking past you in the doorway because they want to prove to you that they're in charge of you.
Right. I don't think they're thinking that in depth.
No, well, I'm framing it the way that it was framed in the podcast.
Yeah. Oh,
So,
yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
so that's how it was presented. Um, it's a point that I would be a little more lenient on if it wasn't like really hammered home, like on three separate occasions. Because again, these guys aren't dog trainers, so I'm really kind of I'm cutting them slack because like they did some research is good and they have
No.
dogs. Both of them have dogs they were talking about, so I know that they've done some training like to the extent that satisfied them and their household and what the dogs need. But to to again, you can't have a fair like argument or debate when you're painting one side as it is and another side as you think it is, which is just not real.
Right. When you're kind of putting your opinion into it already without knowing the alternatives.
Right. Well, even the opinion would be okay if it was based on more like modern factual stuff.
Right. True. Man, I wish they would have interviewed us. That would have worked out just
Should reach
great.
out to them. That'd be cool.
I know. We'll hopefully we'll tag them and they'll see this.
Yeah.
All right. So let's go into. Give me 1 second. Hold on. I'll cut this out if I need to. All right. So let's see. Uh-oh. Where'd my notes go? Come back, notes. Where did you go, notes? All right, there we go.
Where'd you go?
I missed you so. Okay. So this is where they really talked about dominance techniques.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is where they brought up the alpha roll. They brought up the pin downs, Shoba. Reality of it is when it comes to grabbing the dog's neck, alpha roll, dominance, pin, all this stuff that we saw on TV at some point in our lives, or maybe we adopted as dogma for us and our dogs. It's bullshit. I mean, and mind you, and this is coming from a person when I was 18 years old. I tried all of this shit. Let me explain to you guys what happens when you pick a physical fight with a dog. Mariano, maybe you can answer this. What happens when you pick a physical fight with a dog?
You get bitten.
You get bit. So automatically, if you've tried it once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, you are going to get a physical reaction from a physical action that you put on the dog.
Yeah. And frankly, I mean, rightfully so, if you're doing this crazy stuff, like, it's there are certain things in the dog training world that it's our job to discern when a dog does something. It's not that it's not understandable to some degree. Like if a dog's wanting to chase a squirrel, I get it. I don't begrudge the dog, but at the same time, that doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. But if you're like kicking a dog's ass and he bites you, you get no sympathy from me. So there's certain things that definitely you should not be doing.
You should not be doing. And all of these things, when you pick a physical fight with an animal, you always run a very high risk of getting physically challenged back. And this is the number one issue. This is the number one issue with physical dominance, right? Physical dominance should only be used to help help control a situation, not to punish or impugn the dog, right? So if I need to move my dog, I need to support my dog, I need to hold my dog, all of that stuff. But yeah, it's not necessarily the best. Now, parts of this that I disagreed with was when they were starting to kind of talk about training tools as dominant dog techniques, right? This is something that's commonly happens where people villainize tools when they're inanimate objects, right? I think one of my mentors used to give me the comparison. He goes, what is a pencil, right? And I'll be like, I would say like, oh, pencil is like something that you write with. He goes, what else could it be used for? And I said, to erase something. And he goes, what else could it be used for? And I was like, and then he pulls out a pen and he goes, what's a pen? And I said, it's a writing device. And he goes, right, it writes things. And then he goes, it could write you a check for $1 million, or I could stab you in the eye with it. right? The pin by itself does not have a negative connotation, right? It's what you do with that pin that makes it a good or a bad item, right? And so this is what we see a lot with uh, training collars and training tools is people will look at a training tool without ever using it or having an opinion, and they will automatically judge it and then refrain from using it. When in actuality, what we've seen is the people who have refrained from using some of the tools out there that might seem evasive or intrusive, these are actually the ones that save the dog's life, right? Because it gives the owner a whole new different style of control that they've never had before. So the only thing I really disagreed with was this idea of that leash jerks were bad. Yes, definitely leash jerks in constant leash correction, that just tells me that the training method you're practicing is wrong, the timing is wrong, the stimulation levels are wrong. We want to definitely be the least intrusive, minimally aversive. Totally get that. But if you're doing this constantly with a lot of force and aggression, it's just like grabbing your dog with your hand and pinning them down or being physically aggressive. You do run the risk of pissing the dog off or at some point getting a defensive reaction from the dog. However, when training tools are used properly, choke chains, pinch collars, martingales, slip leads, they didn't even name any of those, but they do the exact same thing. When training tools are used properly with the right foundation and the right technique, they can be huge game changers in the shaping of behavior and the maintenance of behavior throughout the rest of the dog's life. So this is just a big point I want to make, because so many people who do not have experience with training tools have opinions with them. That's like me, having an opinion on surgery, right? Like if, let's say my kid, this is kind of extreme, but let's say my kid had a tumor that needed to be removed, and I couldn't bear that the kid had to go under surgery. But I asked the doctor, I said, you know what, doctor, is there any way for us to get that tumor out without surgery, without scalpels, without needles, without anything, just because I don't like the way that those scalpels and needles look, right? The reality of it is there's a tumor that needs to be removed. And there are certain tools that allow and assist us in the removal of that tumor, right? Or that issue, right? And so what we have to do is what we have to understand is the tools by themselves are not bad. The tools used in malpractice can be extremely bad. But at the same time, tools should just be used to support the effort and eventually phased out completely as a necessary tool to continue the dog's behavior. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, it's all about application. A tool is just a tool. Anything. I mean, even a more controversial tool like a firearm, like it's anything. I mean, if you are constantly rewarding a dog with food, there's got to be downsides to that. So
True. And we'll talk about that as well.
yeah,
Maybe
yeah.
podcast.
So context, and there's so much in dog training that my issue, my like main issue with just the whole formulation of this podcast that we're responding to is there wasn't the necessary context, it seemed like, but only when it came to corrective measures. When it came to reinforcing and really like treating and encouraging certain behaviors, they were giving examples of timing with clickers and whatever the case. And then with other stuff, it was just kind of this Saturday morning cartoon of some horrible, like, suspicious guy who thinks his dog's out to get him.
You get a hammer and you scratch.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally get that. Okay, and they were talking about some psychological things like staring at the dog to intimidate them, growling or making noises at the dog. I mean, everything in extremes, and there are some techniques that just aren't. Sadly enough, they are practiced like this, and there are people who swear by it. Like we've all heard that idea of like just bite the dog on the ear one time and he'll respect you, right? I think that they said that in like Snow Dogs. It was like a Disney movie, but everyone thinks that it was like like it's common knowledge, right? Yeah. So psychological dominance, or these psychological dominance theory techniques that they talk about. Also, they brought up this idea that the way dominance theory frames being like an alpha or a leader, is that your dog will appreciate the fact that you have taken the alpha role, and will actually be more comforted knowing that you're the one in charge, right? I think that's kind of how they framed it.
Right.
And I'll be very straightforward. When we look at, those of you who are listening and you heard our new definition of dominance, I would agree, actually, right? That the phrase of our dogs feel a lot better when they know that they're not in charge of certain circumstances, right? And then this one's going to be specifically in situations of anxiety or protection or aggression or defensiveness, right? When the dogs feel supported by something that they know is more capable, stronger, persistent than they are, automatically it makes them feel a lot better. And I'll totally agree with that. However, the way that we achieve leadership role or influential role in the relationship is not by aggression or hitting or beating the dog. It's through structure, routine, consistency, education, and making sure that we're doing our best to be the best parent to our dogs, right?
Yeah, 100%. And I think that it's worth mentioning too that when we talk about this kind of thing of, it's not so much that you can just dominate the dog into, into just accepting whatever the case. A big point that they brought up was you have to frame things in the eyes of the dog, which I agree with largely. But their example was if the dog is barking at somebody or is acting aggressively or is whatever the case, it's because the dog is scared. And fear can definitely pull some aggressive tendencies out of a dog 100%.
Yeah.
Uh, however, a big a big thing that I like to point out is if a dog is acting however the case, anxious, fearful, reactive, protective, territorial, because it's not always fear. There are many reasons why a dog may challenge you that doesn't have to do with being afraid.
Right.
Um, if the dog is having, insert whatever negative association with something or someone, that negative feeling is already there. So
Right.
it's not then the fault of the tool. I mean, certainly we talked about it already. If you do something wrong, that's a different story. You can definitely misuse anything,
Right.
but properly applied, I wasn't necessarily on board with the insinuation that like these tools can lead to like further issues with aggression and because again, when you use
Right.
things right, in my experience, these things get a lot better. And also in my experience, there's typically a certain type of owner that has a certain type of issue with their dog, and because other owners would just take the measures to go about fixing things sooner, not because they're better, but just because they're not afraid of these things. And so
Right.
the first owner, out of sheer compassion, which is understandable, they want to avoid these aversives at all costs. But it'll be, my dog is so anxious, I tried this, I tried that, and he's just not getting better. The vet put him on Prozac, he's still not getting better, so maybe
Right.
I'll try like this. And then they do it
Right.
and the dog finally gets better. And it's like, how many times have you heard, because I've heard a few times where like, I'm so glad you trained this dog because like honestly, I didn't know where else to go from here. The next step was
Yeah.
like putting him down, or
Yeah. We
and
hear
it's
that all the time.
and it's a real thing. That's a problem with, if people are nervous about a tool. If your dog does great with food, then cool. I like food work too. Balance trainers are huge proponents of food work. It's the majority of even a balance training program.
Right.
But appropriate tools with appropriate methodologies that aren't abusive, that are in fact rooted in very clear understandings of how dog behavior works,
Right.
they can help like you wouldn't believe.
Right. And here's the thing. I mean, other than being behavior specialists, other than being what I call dogsmith, right? We're dogsmiths, right? We
Dogs.
speak dog, we talk dog, we understand dogs. We also have to be great teachers, and we also have to be technicians. This is the thing that people forget. We have to know how to use all the technology in our field to be able to provide results. And just the simple idea of villainizing certain tools is already a non-scientific way of dealing with stuff, right? Like if anyone is a scientist or believes in logic, you should definitely try something or expose yourself to something before having an opinion on it. That's just
Right.
the reality of the matter,
Well, good
right?
science is good observation, and I think they fell into the classic pitfall of you know the dominant dog owner or trainer. It just bases themselves on emotion, and it's not all scientific, and then they give examples that are just purely emotive.
Right, right. Next thing I want to move on to is they did bring up Lima, which is least intrusive, minimally aversive. And this is definitely a philosophy that is preached a lot by positive reinforcement trainers. Certification for pet dog trainer, CPDT, is a huge believer in this. And, for the most part, balanced dog trainers completely believe in this as well. However,
Mhm.
there are going to be a couple arguing points that we'd want to just educate people on from the professional field because, um, there are certain ideals that exist in the real world, but they're ideals, and not always do they work out practically the way we would hope that they would ideally, right?
Right.
And so, as again, as technicians, as teachers, as educators, also as dogsmiths, our job is to really figure out, okay, what moment in time do we need to do something? When do we phase something out? When do we add something in? And it is a very dynamic process training an animal, training a dog, and also training their owners. So, real quick, Lima, let's just go over those six. Um, wellness and nutritional and physical state. We want to make sure, number one, sometimes dogs' bad behavior can be a result of bad nutrition and physical health, right? So, whether it's pooping, peeing, limping, acting aggressively, there's certain ways that nutrition and physical health can affect their behaviors. We got to make sure we check those things off the list before we move forward with any type of treatment. Right. Antecedent arrangements. These will be ideas, or what we refer to them as preventative principles. So in essence, what we're doing is we're trying to see, okay, what are the circumstances causing a behavior? How can we adjust those circumstances or change that environment to make sure that this behavior doesn't continue to reinforce itself, or that the dog doesn't continue to become obsessed by this behavior over and over and over? So this is what we refer to as preventative principles or routine development, or spatial control. A lot of dog trainers call it a bunch of different stuff, right? Positive reinforcement. Positive reinforcement, 100% is the best way to teach dog stuff, right? Best way to teach sit and down and stay and come and drop it and leave it and off and quiet and roll over and give paw. Positive reinforcement is one of the easiest forms of shaping any new behavior, um, on the operant conditioning scale, right? Or spectrum, right? Or quadrants, sorry. And so this is where we shape behaviors that we want, before punishing behaviors that we don't want. We have to, in essence, shape the replacement before we start trying to minimize the occurrence of the negative behavior or the undesirable behavior that we want. Okay, so that's number three. Number four, differential reinforcement and alternative behaviors. Or sorry, differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors. Differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors means differential reinforcement means good behaviors get good rewards. The better behaviors get better rewards. The best behaviors get the jackpots, the gold medals, et cetera, whatever that is to your dog. This is differential reinforcement. So if the dog chooses to stay seated and look at me, boom, I'm going to reward that dog. If that dog decides to stay seated and look at me, let's say this is the circumstance of your dog, lunging after other dogs. If that dog sits and looks at me for a longer period of time, oh, that dog gets a better reward. Good dog, good dog, good dog. If that dog completely ignores that dog, and in a situation where that dog would totally react towards that dog, and he decides to not make the decision, he makes the best decision possible. Oh my God, we're going to make it rain. Positive reinforcement, treats, food, toys, whatever it is that dog likes, to really start differentiating. I like this behavior and it's very beneficial for you, and this behavior gets nothing, right? The bad behavior gets nothing, right? So this is where we start seeing the dogs choosing. The fifth one is we talk about extinction, negative reinforcement, negative punishment. I think it's probably best we talk about the whole operant conditioning scale, which they did. And I'm not sure who it was. I'm not sure if it was Chuck or Josh, but one of you guys described the operant conditioning scale perfectly. Operant conditioning exists in 4 quadrants. Okay. Do you remember what those are, Mariano? Of
Yep.
course you do.
Yeah.
Go ahead and break those down for everybody. What are the 4 quadrants of operant conditioning?
Here, I'll list them and then I'll break them down. So positive punishment, negative punishment, positive reinforcer, and negative reinforcer. So when we talk about positive and negative, and they did describe this beautifully, it's not positive, negative in terms of like emotional context. Like a positive punishment is not a good punishment, in good or bad terms. It's adding something to the equation. So a positive punishment would be, I am going to add a correction,
Add something undesirable.
correct. A negative punishment being I'm taking something away that is desirable. And in
Right.
so doing, it's its own form of correction because the dog wants this thing and I very deliberately denied it to the dog.
Right.
Positive reinforcer, same thing. I'm adding something the dog wants. Negative reinforcer, I'm taking something away that the dog wants.
Right. Right. Yeah. Negative reinforcement, taking something away. Sorry, taking something away undesirable is negative reinforcement.
I'm sorry. There you go.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah. So real quick. So positive reinforcement is giving something to reinforce a behavior, something desirable. Negative reinforcement is removing something undesirable to reinforce a behavior. Positive punishment is adding something undesirable. Negative punishment is removing something desirable to punish the dog. We call that the penalty rule, right? If you fucked up, you get something taken away from you, right? Okay, cool. So this is ultimately the operant conditioning scale. The way that it works with Lima is totally make sure the dog's health is right. Try and create the routine and antecedent arrangements to make sure that the dog is not put in a situation where he's constantly failing. We definitely start teaching reinforcement at a very, very young age, or at a very, very early on in the bond. But this is going to be kind of where we start seeing a different shift in ideas with dog trainers. Okay. Most of the CPDT CPDT or people who follow the Lima strictly, what I've also learned is a lot of them do not know how to use the negative reinforcement and the positive punish side of dog training, right? And so what happens is they're focused mostly on positive reinforcement or negative punishment, right? And that's mostly what they're focused on teaching. And very rarely, because this villainization of dog training tools and things like that, and the whole idea of correction is just frowned upon and dog training circles, some dog training circles, this idea of positive punishment, some people just don't even know how to do it. Like they don't even know, right? It's like they hate something and they fear something that they've never tried or learned how to do themselves, right? And so this is always where it's going to be a differentiation between positive reinforcement trainers, dominant trainers, and also balance trainers, right? So dominant trainers will always think, if you don't like something, just fucking let the dog know, right? Physically, abusively, aggressively. Positive dog trainers will go, if you don't like something, say nothing, right? And what our goal is in a balanced dog training approach is we know that the learning process can actually happen a lot quicker if we are controlling both the carrot and the stick, right? So for example, I can get my dog to look at me a lot faster when walking on a leash if I have the ability to grab his attention, right? So what's so funny, if I take a dog out for a walk and he's pulling against my leash and I pull back really quick with a leash jerk, that dog turns around and looks at me. Guess what I can do when that dog turns around and looks at me? I can mark it and reward him.
Mm-hmm.
If I do that 2-3 times in a row, I can do that 7 times in a row because the dog's going to continue to look at me because the rate of reinforcement is happening so much more frequently than it would if I just waited the dog out. Right. So we're able to influence the dog's behavior simply by having some form of physical control or attention grabbing device on the dog, which automatically leads to more positive reinforcement.
Yeah, and
Right.
that's something that we have to talk about when we're being realistic about a training program because even if, we've talked about like in a perfect world in a laboratory, these things work. Sure, you can wait until a dog looks at you, mark it, reward it, and then wait till it does it again, mark it, reward it. And over time, he'll get the correlation. But now when we're talking about how do we do this in a 3-week program when we're teaching everything or when a dog has a more
You live in a
serious.
distracting environment, right?
Exactly, right, or a more serious set of issues, or something that the dog is more interested in than you, or there's lots of circumstances where these things. Is it technically possible? Yeah, maybe. I mean, I would certainly argue that there are a few circumstances where it may not even be like, may not ever happen, no matter how many times you do it. I mean, my dogs, for example, when I first got them, I could be the most interesting person on the planet. They did great with food work in the house until we got to the park and there was distraction going on, and they just didn't have the skill set of being able to tune out distractions actively in order to stay focused on the task at hand. And that's where things like, corrections or positive punishments can be very useful and be very effective at keeping your dogs safe from other things, other dogs, other people.
Right.
And these are things that people need to keep in mind. It's you know, in a good program, if we're just framing things from a dog trainer's perspective, and young dog trainers that typically will listen to this podcast, or people who are curious about how to train their own dogs, I'm sure to all of you, time is very real, money is very real, and certainly,
Mhm.
like, we shouldn't, I mean, in a perfect world, we shouldn't have to compromise any of these things for our dogs, but also reality is what it is, and you can't pay like for a 9 or 10 week program for somebody to finally eventually use food in order to solve all these problems when someone else can do it in a third of the time and therefore a third of the cost,
Third of the
and
cost
more, yeah, and
and
more
more immediate
effectively at
result.
that.
Yeah,
Right, and more safe because it's fail proof. If I've got an e-collar on my dog, if
right.
I've got food, it's possible he'll come to me. If I've got an e-collar, there's really no way around that for him.
Right,
So
right,
it's
right.
a safety thing. I love
And
my
that's
dogs very much.
and that's something, just to bring up a point that they brought up. They did go in the podcast and say that what they call dominant dog training techniques do show results
Mhm.
in the short term. However, they can mess the dog up in the long term, right? And we've totally seen that, right? I don't think there isn't. If you're a dog trainer that has been doing this for more than 5, 6 years, let's just say that, you've definitely seen both sides of the spectrum, where what happens when you only use food, what happens when you only use correction, and you start seeing the limits of it. Like the whole creation of balanced dog training was the understanding that you need both forces. You need the yin and the yang in dog training to be able to help shape and manipulate the dog's behavior to fit into the lifestyles that we live. Um, so I think to their point, they were talking about, it does have short-term results, but what we're looking for here is teaching you guys what it takes to get long-term results. And I always tell my clients, I said, if someone says that they don't use food in dog training, they're idiots.
Mhm.
And someone who says I only use food in dog training, they are confused or inexperienced, right? When you start dealing with more extensive behaviors, you have to be able to have control over both the carrot and the stick. Now, what the difference is, not all dog trainers are created equal. The more experienced and knowledgeable and researched your dog trainer is, they will be able to show you those results in a time that is safe for you and safe for your dog.
Yeah, and can I let me add this clarification too.
Hmm.
It
Hmm.
seems to me that all top level balanced dog trainers,
Hmm.
they run this funny dynamic where it's not quite 50-50. Like when we think of like Michael Ellis,
Hmm.
Tyler Muto, Jeff Gelman, like people who are real top in there, and they seem to be very well rounded, very knowledgeable.
Right. They've been doing it for a while.
Yeah, and a lot of them use food the vast majority of the time, or motivation the vast. I mean, Michael Ellis got really in depth with, there are levels to motivation. I mean, my Mally likes food, but he loves the tug toy, and so you can
Right.
really kind of play with these things in these various forms to get things out of a dog, and that's great. So they use food the majority of the time, but they all agree that corrections are not only necessary depending on what the issues are with the dog, um, but they're kind of more poignant. They're I don't want to say more important, but they're in a circumstance where you have to correct.
Right.
It's typically a circumstance where you don't have time to like sit there and try to otherwise redirect the dog, because you shouldn't be correcting for every little thing. I think one thing that they did, by they I mean, of course, uh, Chuck and Josh, they did explain in a way that I liked, was they did get into the concepts of timing and marking, and they were talking about a clicker. And
Hmm.
we've talked about before, it doesn't need to be a clicker to be a marker. So when you consider all dog training positive, balanced, teaching sit is the same thing as you're just marking it with the verbal sit, down, you know, come or heel or whatever your command is. And just the way that you start reinforcing very specific moments in time, you can have a reinforcer word. Like for me, it'll be good. As soon as the dog little butt hits the ground for the first time, I mark it good. Same thing as a clicker.
Mm-hmm.
Um, with that being said, when I see less experienced dog trainers who do believe in like a balanced approach, they either correct inconsistently, their timing is off, or they do it too much for something that they shouldn't be correcting
Yeah,
for.
good point. That's a great freaking point.
So that's what
That's
I was getting at. Michael Ellis is very clear, very precise about when corrections are appropriate because they're not appropriate in every single circumstance.
not at all. Not at all. They made this. I want to just throw something in that they did say that they were quoting B.F. Skinner in the podcast, and they said,
Mm,
positive punishment, aka correction, is the least effective form for learning,
right.
right? And I just wanted to go ahead and clarify because it's kind of what you're talking about. Um, to give B.F. Skinner was quoted in saying this, in saying in the learning of new behavior.
Right.
Right. And I just want to be very, very clear. Positive punishment is the least effective in the shaping and learning of new behavior. So I want you guys to kind of think about, like, imagine trying to learn something complicated like a dance or a sport. And I mean, this actually happens, funny enough. Or if you worked for an office that never trained you properly to do your job, imagine someone just says, "Hey, you're hired." And you go, "Okay, great." And they don't tell you what your job description is. So when you go sit at your computer, they don't say anything. When you log into your account, they don't say anything. As soon as you click on the wrong window, they go, "What the fuck are you doing?"
Right.
And they punish you, right? Then you go, "Okay, maybe I won't click on that window." So pretty much what happens is positive punishment forces the learner to have to go through a process of elimination in order to figure out what they're supposed to be doing. This is why it was one of the most least effective ways of shaping new behaviors. However, B.F. Skinner then goes and says that positive punishment is a very essential tool in the learning and shaping of consistent behavior.
Right. Overall, not just new behavior.
Overall,
Because of course,
overall.
training is more than just teaching new things. Sometimes it's combating old things. I've got
Yeah,
uh,
sustaining behavior or
right.
controlling behaviors. Yeah,
Right, or things that have been ingrained because again, we've talked about self-reinforcing behavior, something that an owner never taught their dog, but the dog learned it nonetheless. Like, biting. I had a dog, a 7-year-old shepherd who had bitten quite a few times and we definitely did food work. The dog was food driven, but the no bite, there were certain things that it wasn't a conversation you could effectively have with food.
right,
He had a very strong, like urge to challenge, probably because he's had like 6.5 years of doing this with his owners. But there are certainly times to where shaping new behaviors is great. And honestly, it's funny how in nature it works out anyway, because you should never correct a dog for something they don't know. So
right,
you should never correct a dog while you're shaping behavior. But once it's shaped and you're expecting certain things, because that's how you can get into further development of the relationship and patience and really behavioral stuff, socialization, manner building. That's when corrections start to find their place in training.
right, 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 right. And here's just to be clear so we don't keep ranting about the same thing over and over. Those of you guys listening, young dog trainers, people who own dogs, corrections exist in dog training to control impulsive and compulsive reactions from our dogs. That's the only thing that they're there for, right? In essence, they're used to get the dog's attention. Once we have that dog's attention, all the other steps of Lima fit into place,
Mhm.
right? It is really hard for us in practicality to teach our dogs things in a vacuum or where all the variables are completely controlled, right? Where we go from inside the house, where everything is super calm and quiet, where the dog is perfect, as all my clients say, to literally stepping 15 feet out of your front door and now your dog is a maniac,
Right.
right? It's such a huge jump of distraction, such a huge amount of conditioning with the outside that distracts the dog and keeps them from learning new things. So the whole use of any type of positive punishment or physical control on the dog is really just to grab attention so that we can continue the learning process, right? But it should be minimal. It should be used with precaution, and only when necessary. So people who are heavy-handed dog trainers, you need more training.
Yep.
People who are um, only using food on dogs, you're going to definitely see a huge game changer if you learn to use precise correction.
100%.
All right, let's move on a little bit. All right, what else do we got? The third thing that they talked about in the third section of their podcast, they made a comment saying that all aggression is fear-based. Is all fear-based, right? And what
Right.
would your thoughts be on that, Mariano?
Well, that's not always the case. So they're
Mm.
not that's one of those things where they're not 100% wrong, because certainly aggression can be triggered by fear. And if, it's probably one of the most predictable like signs of aggression is the dog afraid, but it's not always the case though. A
Right.
dog can absolutely be aggressive for other reasons. A dog can be territorial, possessive of a toy, of food. There's so many things, so many factors that can play into that, that
Mhm.
it's too sweeping of a statement.
Right. Right. I will say, fear-based is a strong word.
Right.
Sometimes dogs are defensive. Sometimes dogs are insecure. Sometimes dogs are unsure. And I would say that across the board is that why the dogs are becoming aggressive. Because if the dog was completely confident, they wouldn't even have to bare teeth.
That's what I was saying earlier, was the
They would,
negative association is already there.
yeah, they wouldn't have to be. But the fact that anytime that your dog is aggressive, that he's fearful, uh, believe me, guys, I've seen a dog get aggressive just to try and get a rise out of you. I've seen a dog get aggressive just because you got too close to its food bowl. I've seen a dog get aggressive just because he was bigger than the other dog because it made him feel powerful, right? For all the same reasons that humans are aggressive, dogs can also be aggressive, especially when we start looking at some of the data where they say that dogs' mental capacity is that of a 2.5-year-old child,
Right.
right? Those of you guys who want to study more, Stanley Coren, a great dog researcher, listen to his stuff. But he talks about how dogs' emotional states and mental capacity, like if you know a 2.5-year-old kid, they know a handful of words. They understand patterns. They know their colors. They can kind of carry engagement with you. But at the same time, a 2.5-year-old kid can cry one moment, 10 seconds later start laughing, and then 10 seconds later start napping.
Mhm.
Right. And so what kind of happens is the 2.5-year-old kids are kind of live in this moment where they're just going from flow to flow, impulse to impulse, feeling to feeling. But they do have the ability to sit there and learn and memorize patterns and ideas and listen to words and retain information. However, it's not as much as it would be when they're 5 or 6 years old. Right. And so this is when they compare dogs to children. We also have to take that into account when it comes to aggression. Right. If your 2.5-year-old punches you, it's not because he was scared necessarily, right? Or if your 2.5-year-old, pinches you or screams and goes it's not necessarily because that the kid was fearful. Especially if you don't do anything to the kid that makes him fearful. What happens is though that dog and child might have had a surge of emotion or threw a tantrum that they may not know how to process yet at their stage in development.
Right, and can I inject another possibility too, is sometimes it's possible that the dog is fearful, but it's not for a logical reason, like mailman syndrome. The
Right,
dog
right,
may be
right.
afraid of the mailman, but there's nothing to suggest that we want you to attack this guy. There's not there
Totally.
so there's no legitimate reason for you to then seek out this behavior. Same thing
Right.
with a kid. Kids can be afraid of absolutely nothing.
Right. It's kind of like PTSD. Like dogs get PTSD with some, self-reinforcing behaviors where
Right.
they think the mailman's constantly coming back every day to come and infiltrate the property. And, this is their obsession. This is what happens. Right. So,
Here's a big issue that I have now that we're bringing up fear-based ideology is ultimately I think a lot of this stuff stems from ungrounded energy. So like a dog that is just too uppity in terms of like excitement or arousal levels.
yeah, quote
They
unquote anxious.
anxious, yeah, they do too many things, and it's easy for them then to create something that wasn't there, like the mailman syndrome. And then because when a dog sees a mailman and is barking, he's not calm in that moment. He's excitable. Oh, somebody's here. Bark, 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 bark. Maybe he'll relax when he goes away. Um, and so I think neutrality is a big idea, and understanding uh, when we're dealing with this kind of stuff, if you're not sure about how a dog that is fearful or or otherwise fear based giving some sort of reaction, aggressive, nervous, whatever the case, bringing a dog back to emotional neutral, like a 2-year-old, if they're
Mm-hmm.
in the middle of crying or like laughing, it's going to be hard to teach them something in that moment. When they're
Right.
nice and stable and neutral, then they're open enough, like mentally speaking, to be able to retain new information. And the dogs work in a similar fashion. So they're very smart, but they're very much emotive and they're very like go go go. And they're not smart enough to understand how their emotions can get them in trouble, even if logically they would know better if they were calm.
Right. Right. That's a good point. And so dogs are really smart, but there is always a limit, right? How much we expect from them versus, versus what they're capable of.
Yeah,
Right.
I like to say this to people, and I won't drag this out. I just want to make this one last point. Is something that I've been saying to clients for maybe a couple years now is what a dog knows will always depend to a degree on how they feel.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Just to let you know, we do got to wrap up because we're running out of time on our recording space.
Yep.
But yeah, I guess let's go ahead and, I mean, definitely a huge applause to Chuck and Josh. We know you guys are not dog trainers. You guys did a hell of a job educating the public and definitely giving your 2 cents on the ideas. We just really hope that we could shed some new light on these ideas, because one of our main goals as dog trainers is to really help teach people the whole picture, right? And as professionals, the more that we can educate dog owners, dog lovers, the better lives we can create for our dogs. And this is ultimately the main reason. This is what we feel is going to, prevent dogs from having to get given up, to the shelter or the rescue, or have to get put down. This is what we know will increase retention rates at rescues, right? If you adopt a dog out, that dog should not come back 2 months later because something bad happened. Right. So the more that we can educate the public and help them understand the bigger picture of dog training, and most importantly, the more the more that dog trainers in the industry have to learn.
Yeah, and
Right.
I would
Just to
like to
stay just to stay a step ahead of you. Go ahead.
sorry, I would just like to thank, them for even if we disagree on certain things. I want
Right.
everybody to keep in mind if they ever hear this and are interested in us having a conversation, we'd love to. And if anybody who's listening to this who, younger dog trainers who maybe get a little defensive about being challenged on an idea or whatever the case, understand that this is how we all get better. So
Yeah.
it's only ever a good thing that somebody with that platform like they have is willing to discuss these things and give us their 2 cents, because that's how we all come to agreements. That's the beautiful like nature of being able to speak to each other. That's what makes humans separate from everything else. And so definitely don't knock them for it. They're very good podcasters. I enjoyed it too. I didn't agree with everything, but it was great. It was very well put together. They're funny. They love their dogs. That's without question. So
100%.
just keep that in mind.
If you love your dog, you're cool with me. That's all I got to say. All right. We want to thank you guys one more time. Thanks, Chuck and Josh from Stuff You Should Know on iHeartRadio. Again, my name is Brent LaBrada, and that's Mariano Alvarez. We're going to go ahead and put our Instagram handles right here, down here at the bottom of the screen. If you guys have any other questions, please feel free to email us at it's dogtrainerspodcast@gmail.com. We'll put that right down there as well. Send us any questions, comments. Go ahead and leave them down in our YouTube channel or on our podcast channel. And we look forward to seeing you guys in our next episode. All right. We love you guys. We'll see you guys soon. Take care. Thank you for listening to the Dog Trainers Podcast, a podcast created by dog trainers for dog trainers, or anyone who's ever fallen in love with man's best friend.